So, good evening, good afternoon, good morning to wherever in the world you may be joining us from. Again, please note that in the chat if you feel so moved. You are very welcome here in this Zoom community where we will learn together about the connections between nuclear power, artificial intelligence, environmental and social concerns. My name is Kathleen Sullivan, and I'm the Nuclear Guardian Fellow at the Joanna Macy Center of Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado, and the co-chair of the Nuclear Truth Project, the two sponsoring organizations of our webinar today. It is my honor to host Professors M.V. Ramana and Bene Bravini, who are experts in their respective fields, and as a special side note for me, dear friends of mine, who were both introduced to me by the wonderful Felicity Ruby. And I don't know if she's on yet, but she's responsible for bringing together a lot of people. In fact, Ramana, I think you and I met for the first time during this time of year at the NPT Review Conference in the year 2000. Benny came to me more recently, but it's truly thrilling for me to bring the two of you together in this webinar. I'm calling in from the unceded lands of the Cheyenne, the Ute, and the Arapaho nations and peoples who are our indigenous relatives here in Boulder, where the weather this year has been like no other year on record. There has literally been no winter in Boulder, Colorado. The rainfall and the snowpack has been deeply depleted. We are in a deep drought. And that is also true of much of here in North America. And as we no doubt all understand, data centers dominate and contaminate precious water supplies. And as we all know, water is life. What we will hear today is an interweaving of concerns that we all share and an inspiration for our action moving forward. Thank you to everyone for taking the time to join us here today. I'm now going to briefly introduce our speakers and hand over to them. Please think of your questions and comments. We will go from here in the room where we have people live here in the room at Naropa University, and we will also be looking for your questions and comments on the Zoom where we have people calling in from places across our precious planet. So to introduce our speakers. Dr. M.V. Ramana is a professor and Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. His research interests are in the broad areas of international security and energy supply. His latest book is Nuclear is Not the Solution, The Folly of Atomic Power in the Age of Climate Change. Welcome, Ramana. Dr. Bene Bravini is a professor of political economy of communication at the University of Sydney and senior visiting fellow at the Department of Media and Communication at the London School of Economics. Before joining the Academy, Bene worked as a journalist in Milan, New York, and London for CNBC, RAI, and The Guardian. Her latest book is entitled, Is AI Good for the Planet? Welcome, Bene. Thank you both so much, and I'm handing it over to you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Kathleen, for this wonderful invitation. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to be here with you today. I want to start by sharing a few slides with you, and let's make this happening very quickly. So I want to make sure that you can see properly what I will say. So the question really is AI good for the planet? And I started raising this question around 6 years ago, probably even earlier. And at that time, I'm sure you remember that this conversation around AI was focusing mostly on science fiction places and world where AI was considering becoming a sort of a chain of sentient bots, while artificial and general intelligence threatens the human species. But at the same time, AI was always considered this magic wand capable of sorting out every problem that humanity will face, from major climate events to the crisis of capitalism, especially, and to the crisis of democracy. And obviously, we also saw in many instances the way in which this magic tool that artificial intelligence presented itself to be was becoming an excuse, really, to not change anything that is wrong in the world, not addressing the inequalities and the war and the crisis of the world, but to keep the status quo. And this type of solutionist discourse, this idea that AI could, as a magic wand, sort out the problem of humanities, is something that I think you're very used to. And it's something that we see, for example, when we started developing the concept of the cloud, that is one of the most, in my view, efficient and incredibly developed idea of the magic of technology. This immaterial, fluffy representation of the cloud that in fact are data centers that are noisy, dusty, polluting. But for decades, we've been presented with this idea of the materiality and the impossibility to really touch these magic clouds that are wandering in the sky and are attracting with them opportunities for humanity to be liberated. So this idea of technology as liberation is something that has been with us since at least the major development in Silicon Valley, since the development of the internet. So if we think, for example, of information superhighways, we always think of something that will bring us to a future where hierarchies don't exist and where people can just connect freely in a world that is all equal and healthy and absolutely clean. And also, if we think about these mythologies, which has been characterizing, I've been characterizing AI for the beginning of this conversation. I remember that when we talk about AI, we refer to something that was developed already in the 50s. So it's not something new. It's just this major PR push that has brought us to be discussing AI the way we are doing at the moment, and the major economic development that is behind it. But again, this idea of AI as artificial intelligence as something that is replicating cognitive abilities, the learning, the vision, the mind of humans. And if we pause a little bit to think about this, obviously, it's obvious that by referring to AI in this way, we're missing out one of the crucial, actually, feature of AI, which is, the fact that actually AI is indeed incredibly material. And obviously, the materiality of AI is something that gets lost if we consider it extremely just artificial, and if we consider it to be not linked to something that is actually material, that we can measure, something that is actually tangible. And what we've seen recently, especially in the last 2 years, is a change in discourse. So as Kathleen was highlighting at the very beginning, we saw, for example, and we know that we have a problem with data center. We have a problem with water. We have a problem with energy issue. And so while I welcome, that finally public debates have engaged with this major problem, I also want to warn us about the fact that the environmental cost of artificial intelligence are not just linked to the water and to the issue concerning energy linked to the data centers. Because what is really crucial, and it's something that we are going to debate also today, is that we need to consider AI in its complete and total materiality, which means to consider AI as technology, as machine, as infrastructures that deplete constantly with their scarce resources, the production, the consumption, and of course, they generate increasing amounts of energy in their use, in the way in which we discard them, and therefore they constantly trigger problems of pollution, problem of material toxicity, which is something, of course, when we think about the waste and the, for example, of the nuclear, it's very similar, the problem of not being able also to manage all the waste that they are generating. But I want you to ponder just a little bit on the why the discourse around AI has changed radically in the last 2 years. So why we suddenly have the New York Times talking about it, we have the New Yorker having issues about that, and for 10 years I've been trying to get this conversation in the news, and it was almost impossible to have a conversation about environmental impact. But I remember very clearly that back in 2018, in a closed room with executives from Microsoft, they told me, you're onto something that we don't want to disclose and discuss until we are forced to. And so what happened in the last 2 years and a half is that we had generative AI being put in the world, being put out in the world without any regulation, without any pondering, without any thinking about it. And at that point, we have major digital lords that had to come clean in the sense that they had to start sharing one of the biggest problems they have. So in the words of Microsoft executive, they had to share that they were not going to meet the sustainability claims they had in the past decades. We had, I don't know if you remember, but I do clearly, that Microsoft was claiming to become zero negative, in terms of emissions. And finally, in the sustainability report, they had to say, wait, we have this major problem. Our production, our consumption of water has becoming impossible for us to control. Our energy needs have increased, and this has been actually corroborated by many reports in the last 2 years, in the last year and a half, I would say. And one of the major ones that I'm sure you're familiar with is the one from the International Energy Agency. It's a report that is extraordinary because it's the first time that an International Energy Agency, and I'm sure that also Ramana will have a lot to add to this, is reporting specifically on AI. And it's explaining that the global data center electricity consumption is on this trajectory to be more than double by 2030. So more than double is huge. And obviously, the US is one of the biggest consumer of this electricity. And to a level that actually I saw the last 2-3 reports, also corroborated by a very recent Berkeley study that shows how between now and 2030, data centers are expected to account for something like half of all US electricity demand growth. So this is huge, and this is why we have this conversation in the public domain. At the same time, we finally have more measurements and data to share about the impact of water. So, like, just to give you a very, I think, simple example, when in the old times, when our Google searches happened completely without generative AI aid, we consumed roughly like 0.3 watt hours of electricity, while a request through Google Overviews, so the new Gen AI that is pushing us when we want to do a search, is consuming roughly 2.9. So it means that we're talking about 10 times more consumption of water than the classic Google search. And when we think of the amount of Google searches that we do, when we think that Google in the Western world is a major monopolist at over 90% of the searches, then we'll see that this will require something like 10 terawatt per hour of additional electricity per year. Again, numbers that are indeed staggering. So while this is absolutely crucial, I want you to ponder for a little bit more on this definition of AI. Because when I showed you the mythologies at the very beginning, I'm sure you grasped how actually by emphasizing the artificiality of the technologies, we of course don't focus enough on the materiality, and therefore we can't really understand how to refer to this AI, which is actually also a great marketing and discourse strategy, because it is impossible to define only one AI model. There are major different applications with very different characteristics that carry very different problems. And so having just one category of AI means to simplify to a level that all criticism becomes difficult, because the engineers will tell me, what is the AI you're talking about? And for this reason, I've been using in my work a definition that is very focused on the definition of AI in its materiality as technology, as machines and infrastructures. Because if we focus on this definition, then we can connect. But at the same time, what I want you to be very clear about is that AI, in the way we are talking about AI, is a political and economic project. So AI is a political economic project. It's not like a kind of magic tool, as very often we discuss in public debates, because technology is always, in a full sense, social. And I'm borrowing from one of the best cultural theorists that England ever had, to remind us that the way we are shaping technology is on us, and we can decide in what ways this type of technology can help us actually moving forward. But let's remember that it's not something magic and artificial that can help us develop in a better world or a better humanity. So once we are clear about the definition of AI, then we are also clear on the way in which we can start to assess and understand the environmental impact that this technology, machines, infrastructures, technologies have on the environment. And what I did in the last 6-7 years is really trying to engage into the development of a framework to really understand the complexities of this environmental impact. So, and I did this in a book and in various papers, where I developed the concept of the eco-political economy of AI. Because if AI is a political economic project, then we still miss the connection with the environment, which is something that is crucial for us to really assess the environmental and social impact of technology. And how do we assess this? Well, the first step is to understand that we need to look at the entirety of the global supply chain of AI, and we need to focus first and foremost on the type of so-called critical minerals that are needed. And this is becoming one of the biggest problems that is not as much in the public domain as the data centers, carbon footprint, and water needs, but it is equally crucial, because we know that the so-called, again, a mythology, rare elements that are not rare at all, they're actually available in nature, but they're difficult to mine and they're difficult to separate. And therefore, they are so demanding in terms of water and in terms of the environment, are often devastating communities. And obviously, especially like now giving this talk from Australia, we know the devastation of Aboriginal land that we saw in major regions in Australia. If we think of Western Australia, for example, one of the major supply for lithium, we saw the devastation of land. We see the troubles and the health hazards that mining is impacting. We see the appropriation of land very often. But then we also know that geopolitically, this is something that Ramana will discuss also in a moment, we see the connection with war. So we see already the connection of AI with war, but even more when we talk about appropriating this type of resources, when we know that China is one of the biggest, luckiest countries to have rare minerals and to have different types of these critical minerals. So again, we need to start with the global supply. And how to start with the global supply? We start understanding the devastation that this type of mining for tech is, creating for the world. The second segment of the global supply chain is the one that is obviously more debated at the moment for the reason that I highlighted at the beginning, for the Gen AI advent. And I have here a very simple image, really, where I traced some comparison, because the first time that I was presented with the biggest and one of the most pioneering, most important calculation that were done at Massachusetts Amherst of the carbon footprint of the training of one simple LLM model. Now we are used to language model, but this was a calculation of 2019. And I always remind engineers, and I'm always reminded by them, that these are generalization and it's all fine. But what I want to establish is like a comparison that we have between the incredible amount of energy that we need when we train these models with, for example, the carbon intensity of our trips, by plane. And when we see that if we take a flight between London and Rome, we consume roughly 234 kilograms of carbon emission. But when we train an LLM model, we consume 284,000 kilograms. Then even if it's a generalization, even if it's not perfect, even if it depends on the types of neural networks, it depends on the computing capacity of the model. And it's true, engineers are working to reduce the emission of these major computing facilities, but still it is staggering. And it's something that as people, as engaged in it, we should always, be worrying about. And this is just the very beginning of our environmental impact assessment of the second segment, because we always need to consider also the using of a model. So in other words, we need to consider how we interact with a model, our prompts with a model, the so-called inference phase. And at the moment, we have new data coming in that are showing that the inference phase is even more demanding in terms of energy and in terms of water. And we are assessing the second bit, the one that is more in the public domain. And then we move in the third, segment, a segment that is actually particularly important because we have data, especially from the UN, that are showing that our e-waste dump, and the production of e-waste has been growing in the last 10 years by something like 86%. And what is really worrying about this data is also that only 1% of the e-waste gets recycled. So the rare elements, for example, the critical minerals that have been used are really not recycled at all. So this opens up for major actually opportunities for us to really intervene and to really ask the right questions. But at the moment, the digital waste growth is something that should be at the forefront of any conversation, because again, the violence of colonialism are perpetrated again with the development of AI capitalism, with the development of this AI political project that we see, because the biggest e-dumps, like waste, digital dumps in the world, are obviously in former colonies. So, if we think of China, they would dump them in Vietnam or in Cambodia mainly. If we think of Europe, it's all, dumped in Kenya, for example, where we have outside Nairobi, one of the biggest e-dump in the world. And what is the environmental impact of the digital waste that is completely pushed, in a constant growth of consumption, to the limits, to a planet that has limits, and we need to think in terms of the environmental harms for communities. Again, communities that are often being displaced by this type of e-dumps, by this type of digital waste. And so again, we see the same logic of this type of AI capitalism being perpetrated in the world with the colonists that are always having to have the burden of this type of developments. And let's remember that despite the efforts of especially of Western countries to push AI and infrastructures for AI in the so-called global South, we also know for sure that a lot of these countries at the moment don't need this kind of development. And actually, it's incredibly detrimental for the local economies. And it's absolutely something that is becoming unmanageable, but also in times of climate emergency, which is something that seems almost to be cancelled, especially in a country like the US at the moment, as if the climate emergency didn't exist anymore. As if the fact that we know that we are on a trajectory for 2.5 Celsius increase didn't matter, because we know the pledges of Paris and we know we didn't meet them. So just to conclude, actually, I want to propose, and this is where I'm connecting also with Ramana, because there are ways actually to address this. And when I see and I look specifically at the US, for example, at the moment, and I see so much resistance being really gathered together against data centers development, I see actually people that are understanding, especially the impact of this environmental cost for the community. So the idea, again, of this clouds that is fluffing in the sky is not something that we can solve. It's something that has been solved for decades, but it's something that finally has been broken down into the dust, the noise, the pollution. And finally, now, last week, we just had a new publication that has showed also how this generation of heat island within data centers is also incredibly detrimental for the environment, and it's something that engineers have not been able to address at the moment. But for me to see the level of resistance that is generating, especially in the US at the moment, with, you see Tulsa, for example, communities being absolutely against data centers, but you see it in Colorado with a bill that is the most fought political discussion ever. You see it in New Jersey. And so this is something that makes me realize that actually civil society is alive and wants something different. And so if we really embrace, especially this understanding of non-market forms of value, so the logic of repair, the values of care that indigenous knowledge especially has been bringing to us as a sort of a stewardship and guidance of how actually to manage and how to thrive as humans with the environment. I think that actually we can find answers, to how to manage and how to dispel this idea that AI is something that can be ever sustainable. AI is not sustainable. It's not something that will become sustainable. And this idea of investing in commons and public-based tech infrastructure is something that we can pursue. And when I see solutions adopted in Europe, for example, deciding to drop American big tech, for example, in favor of very local, smaller forms of data centers, the local scale, I actually become more, hopeful. And at the same time, to dispel this usual magical thinking around AI and trying to understand a reappropriated digital literacy that actually makes us want to decide what to consume, how to consume it, and also reconnect us to nature in a way that is more caring and in a way that can really respect the environment. I think that actually the solutions are there. And I think that because technology is always in a sense social, we decide also how to shape the solution, and we decide this together. So I want to give Ramana now the opportunity to tell us everything about the mythologies of the nuclear and in the connection with AI. And thank you very much for your time. And we'll take questions very soon.
Thank you, Benny. Such a very rich point to sort of start off my discussion. I am trying to find my thing to share. And yeah, there you go. Thank you. So thank you all for this opportunity to talk. And thanks, Kathleen, in particular, for inviting me to share the stage with the brilliant Benny. And you said that we were not very conventional, but actually, we are going to do a conventional presentation one after the other because in a different world, I would have probably just continued and chatting with Benny in the sort of the middle of the talk and interrupting and doing it in a very different way. But that's not how we have planned this. So it's a much more conventional planning. I want to sort of pick up on this in a couple of ways. One is the discussion about the energy demand growth and the attempt to try and think about nuclear power as a solution. I just want to say that a lot of the research focuses on the amount of energy demand that is being increased. And I would like to sort of step back a little bit to point out that it's less about the magnitude of the increase and more about the fact that we are having an increase at all. It's about the direction, right? We should be living in a world where we should be reducing energy and material use if we are to try and not just deal with climate change, but with all of the different planetary boundaries that we are transgressing at this point, right? Planetary scientists have put up this formalism of planetary boundaries, and the latest update from that series of studies is that 7 out of the 9 planetary boundaries have been breached as of 2025. So we are going exactly in the wrong direction. And so it's the direction that matters more to me than the absolute magnitude of the demand. And the reason I mention that is you are going to see arguments from the more technocratic elements in this debate who will try to say, oh, this energy demand is not so great, the water demand is not so great, by comparing it with some absolute number. And that's usually not the right comparison, but nevertheless, I just want to sort of mention that. I also want to pick up on the idea that AI is a very solutionist discourse that Benny sort of talked about, that it is a way of trying to keep the system going on in the same fashion without necessarily changing anything, even though the system doesn't work for most people, by making the argument that all of the problems that you're facing, they will be met with AI. And AI is one of those vague and nebulous terms that people can use it in multiple ways. So in my own discussions, for example, there's a lot of people who would say, for whom AI these days really means large language models. And it's hard to make a case that these large language models are contributing to much social good per se, right? But if you try to engage with them in argument, they will immediately say, but AI can identify cancers well before human technicians can do, or it can do protein folding or something like that. And what they are really using is the idea that AI is this very nebulous thing, that a machine learning tool that only is trained on bios of various body scans can teach about cancer, to use the same term for also large language models, right? And in that sense, the solutionist impetus here is to posit AI as an answer to the kinds of problems that everyday people might be facing, right? You all know people who are who are struck with cancer, and you always feel, oh, maybe if that person had been diagnosed 6 months earlier, their chances would be better. So that's a real problem that many people face. And AI and those who are advocating for AI are trying to position us. Nuclear power is very much a similar idea. And the idea is that nuclear power is going to be this technology that allows us to keep growing the way we are while not exceeding the climate targets. That's the idea that they are sort of talking about. And in the particular context of AI, this thing has come up in the last few years. What you saw was many of these big tech companies started making announcements about how they are going to invest in nuclear power. So a few years ago, you saw, in 2024, Google makes an announcement, Amazon made an announcement, and then a couple of years later, Meta made an announcement, and so on and so forth. All of these things are making announcements, and there's also a kind of race of making announcements. And as with many other things, you have to always dig a little deeper to understand what's happening. But in my own case, my general focus of my research had been on nuclear power. And I mean, AI, of course, I'd been hearing about it through various other means, but because of all these announcements, I found myself being subject to various people asking, "Oh, I hear that nuclear power is having a big revival because of this AI and journalists and other people." And that's when I started digging a little bit deeper into this and getting to understand what's happening here in the AI world. And what you see is, I mean, I'll just sort of jump to what I sort of learned by reading some of these announcements more carefully. And I'll just summarize it in two little points. I mean, there's a lot to talk about, but I'm going to just, in the interest of time, sort of move fast. So the two main points I want to make is that if you look at all these announcements, many of these announcements do not even mention how much money they are investing. The two biggest announcements that I've seen, one is from Amazon and one is from NVIDIA. And in both cases, they also do something which is very standard, which is they don't tell actually how much Amazon itself is investing or how much NVIDIA itself is investing. They say we are part of a consortium, of a group of companies or entities that are investing, and together we are investing $650 million, $500 million, whatever, right? Okay, so this seems like a lot of money, but you have to sort of put that into perspective. So in the United States right now, there is not a single nuclear reactor under construction, right? All over North America, right? But the last time around there was a nuclear reactor under construction was in the state of Georgia. This is the Vogtle project. And that Vogtle project, those two reactors that were built there, they cost 36, somewhere between 36 and 37 billion dollars. Okay. And that's a kind of scale you should be thinking about if you're thinking about even a reasonable amount of nuclear energy being generated in order to meet some fraction of the demand growth that these AI and data centers are being to cause, right? Of course, if you look at the announcements also, they will typically not talk about these large nuclear reactors, though there have been some cases where they also talk about those, and I'll get to that in a second. But usually they talk about something called small modular reactors. I don't have time to really discuss what small modular reactors are, but I'm happy to talk about in the question and answer session. But again, I'll give you another number to sort of compare this $650 million or $500 million with. And the number is the cost estimate of the first small modular reactor project that was proposed for construction in the United States. This is the so-called NuScale design. NuScale is the only small modular reactor design that has been licensed by the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission for construction within the United States. So it has a design certification. And that there was a proposal to build 6 NuScale reactors in the state of Idaho, and that cost went up to $9.3 billion. And at that point, basically the customer base vanished and the project was canceled. So even for a relatively small amount of electricity generation from small modular reactors, the cost was $9.3 billion. And so the $500 million or the $650 million will not buy these companies even one nuclear reactor. So there's a lot more money that is going to be required, and it's not clear where that money is going to come from. Okay. And the second thing to note, if you look at all of these announcements, is what are the dates they are talking about. Most of these announcements will say it's going to happen by 2030, 2032, 2035, etc., etc. Again, you have to read these announcements very, very carefully to understand what they are talking about. And if you think about 2030 even as a date, 2030 is not that far away. Okay. Now, there are two things to note there. The first is the energy demand is happening today. It's not happening in 2030, right? And so if you have to wait for these nuclear reactors to come online, then you should not be building any data centers today. If nuclear power is indeed going to power all of these data centers, you should not be building any of these data centers today. But that's not something that these companies are going to be willing to live with, because they know that the AI is very likely to be a bubble and the bubble will burst quite soon. And so they have to do all of this activity in advance of that bubble bursting, right? So they are not going to be waiting for all these nuclear reactors to be built before they start constructing their data centers. The second thing to note is that historically, all of the nuclear reactors that have been built around the world, the majority of them, the vast majority of them have been delayed. So when they say the reactor is going to be ready in 2030 or 2035, you have to add about 10 years to that, typically 5 to 10 years at least. So in reality, all of these new small modular reactor designs, which have never been built anywhere in the world, will probably come online only by the late 2030s, early 2040s at best. And so the contribution of that to the growing energy demand from data centers today is likely to be zero, at least till that point, right? So that's something to remember. So uh, these are kind of just reality checks about how the nuclear might or might not fit into the demand response. So one question to ask is, why are these companies? Because I'm sure there are smart people in Google and Amazon and so on who know what the data is about the costs of these reactors, how long they take. Why are they making these announcements? Of course, I don't know the answer to that. I don't sit in those boardrooms when they are discussing what kind of an announcement to make, but I can make a guess, right? And the guess comes from the point that Benny mentioned about Microsoft saying, this is a topic that we don't want to be seen discussed, the energy demand and the emission growth, right? And one reason why they would know that this is not something that they would like to be discussed in public is the example of the cryptocurrency industry, Bitcoin and so on. So if you remember from a few years ago, there were a lot of newspaper and media headlines saying, Bitcoin mining is taking up so much energy that it is causing emissions that are larger than some countries, et cetera, et cetera. Really bad publicity for the cryptocurrency industry. And they don't want that kind of thing. And then what did that lead to? Some countries started having regulations on Bitcoin mining, on cryptocurrency mining. So under the Biden administration, for example, the first set of regulations came about for the cryptocurrency. In China, they even banned Bitcoin mining because of the environmental impacts. Right? That is the direction that these big tech companies don't want to go in. They don't want to be regulated. They don't want their data center construction to be blocked on account of environmental or energy demand reasons. And so they have to come up with some kind of a narrative. And the narrative they've come up with is, let's build nuclear power plants. So anybody who says, oh, I'm concerned about your energy emissions, they say, don't worry about it. We are investing in small modular reactors. We're investing in advanced reactors and so on and so forth. So it's really, and also if you think about the amounts of money they're investing, they are a very small fraction of the kinds of revenues that they have. If Google really wanted to build nuclear plants, they can easily fork out the $37 billion that the Vogtle reactors cost, but they're not doing that. They're actually investing maybe a few $100 million. So I would suspect that a few $100 million actually comes out of their public relations budget rather than their energy budget, right? It's much more about keeping the public discourse under control. Okay. Now, what is the problem with all of this discourse is that some of these reactors are likely to be built, because once these companies say that they're going to invest a certain amount of money, what you're seeing is a whole bunch of nuclear vendors, nuclear reactor companies saying, oh, we have a design, you can build it, and so on and so forth. And of course, with the Trump administration, you can make up a design, on a paper napkin, and the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission will probably also approve it at this point, right? And all they care about is, can you build it in 18 months? Which is the kind of demand that the Trump administration has made. So you're going to end up with a whole bunch of designs which may or may not be really safe. But the problem with nuclear power is that all nuclear reactors are susceptible to accidents, severe accidents. We've seen this in the case of Three Mile Island, in the case of Fukushima, Chernobyl. We are, close to the 40th anniversary of the Chernobyl accident today. April 26th was the 40th anniversary. And the lesson from all of these accidents is that because nuclear reactors are a complex technology, you can never rule out the possibility of an accident because you simply cannot envision all the possible ways in which a reactor can have a severe accident that leads to radioactive materials contaminating the biosphere. And once there's an accident, the costs of these accidents are immense, right? In the case of Fukushima, the cost estimate is about $750 billion. And guess who's going to pay for all of the $750 billion? It's going to be mostly the people of Japan. It's going to be the taxpayers and the public at large, right? And that is going to be true in the United States or so on. And this is something which is really of concern in the case of the United States, because one of the kinds of investments that some of these big tech companies are doing is to invest in restarting old reactors. And that is partly for the reason that I mentioned. A new reactor is going to take such a long time to build that they say, oh, how about we reopen some reactor that is 40, 50 years old that has been shut down because many of the parts have to be replaced, or it's past its the sort of expiry date, as it were. And so two of the reactors that have been highlighted for this kind of reopening are the Three Mile Island reactor and the Palisades reactor in Michigan. And the Three Mile Island reactor is the sort of sister unit to the one that melted down in 1979. And below is the picture of President Jimmy Carter as he visited the control room of that reactor. And Microsoft is investing money in a utility company that wants to reopen a reactor that had been shut down a few years ago. Likewise, in Michigan, there's an old reactor called Palisades, and a company that has never operated a nuclear power plant, whose expertise is basically in building casks to deal with spent radioactive fuel, has applied and has been approved to restart this old nuclear reactor. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why this is a really bad idea. And even some of the experts that the company itself is referring to have said this is a bad idea. And yet we are going forward into that. So that's one of the dangers. The second danger, associated with nuclear power, is that the technology that is used to make nuclear energy is closely linked to the technology that can be used to make nuclear weapons. There are a range of reasons that I can talk about, but I'm not going to talk about right now. And that is also something which should be of concern if nuclear power is really going to be spreading around the world. A third challenge is the one that Benny mentioned, which is the fact that nuclear power plants necessarily produce radioactive waste that remain hazardous for millennia, because some of the radioactive half-lives of these materials run into the hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years. And it's impossible to actually have any kind of solution that we can think of as definitively safe, because we are not going to be around for the 100,000 years to see whether any solution that you propose is really in the real world going to be safe, in the sense of not allowing these materials to leak out of the underground repositories where they are going to be stored, and are they going to contaminate groundwater or not. That's something which we are not going to be able to see. So for a number of reasons, nuclear power is a really bad idea. I have not talked about it, but in my book, I talk also about why nuclear power is not a feasible solution to climate change. That it is, so even the other argument that you hear for nuclear power, that we need to deal with, that we need nuclear power to deal with climate change, is not really something that one holds up under scrutiny, because of the high cost of these building reactors and how long it takes. So I'm going to now dial down into another aspect that is related to AI, and that is the use of AI for accelerating killing and maiming of people, namely through the military. And this was something which was not widely recognized till recently, but in the last couple of months, we've seen a lot of discussions about this company called Anthropic. And Pete Hegseth sort of having this big argument saying, Anthropic saying that they don't want their technology to be used by the military for certain very specific purposes. And Hegseth saying, how dare you tell us what we are supposed to be doing? And then the whole thing started with the news about the fact that the Claude large language model that Anthropic has developed was used in the raid that went to kidnap Maduro and his wife from Venezuela. And this was actually not good publicity again for Anthropic. So they sort of tried to say something. And it turns out that Anthropic is actually quite tightly tied into the Pentagon. So it was used again in the context of the early strikes in Iran, including possibly the strike that killed over 160 school children in Minab. But the news about AI being used in the military also came out during the genocide in Gaza, news about genocide in Gaza, when the Israeli military was reportedly using this system called Lavender to identify people that they said were related to Hamas and using that to bomb people, often when they are actually in the homes with their families. They had another program called Where's Daddy that they were using to identify when they were actually at homes so that then a whole bunch of people can be killed at the same time. I don't know why that's what they're going to do. And the last thing I'd say here is that when Anthropic sort of decided that they didn't want this kind of publicity, and I can say more about that later on. The US Army said it is also going to build its own chatbot, so then it won't have any of these regulations or any of kind of negotiations. But why is this happening? And the reason why this was happening is basically speed. And this was sort of very well explained by this chap called Shyam Shankar, who's the chief technological officer for Palantir. Palantir is one of those evil corporations that's in part of every of these war efforts and parts of all kinds of different things. And what he said was, when you compare it with the earlier Gulf War, it took 6 months of planning for about 50 to 100 people to generate what they call targets, namely places that they want to bomb. And here, one person in 2 weeks did exactly the same thing. In the case of Iran, that is the claim that he makes. Now, just to give some context, Shyam Shankar is not just a CTO in Palantir, but he was also incorporated into the army as a sort of reserve officer. And many of these people actually see their role as trying to enhance the ability of the US military to kill and maim people around the world. And they think of that as something that is very important for them to do. And what we see also is that in the last several years, there's been a lot of interest in Silicon Valley into getting into the Pentagon and getting contracts from them to aid in the killing. So this comes from the Pentagon itself giving large contracts to the fact that there are many venture capitalists in Silicon Valley who are investing in companies that are developing technologies that can be used in various ways to kill people. And finally, also a whole bunch of things that we are not necessarily in control of, like our pension funds putting in money into some of these militarization activities. So that's something to be really concerned. And even in the case of Anthropic, even after all of these things, what Anthropic's CEO was basically saying in a public interview is that we have said to the Department of War, and I should sort of pause to say that one thing you can be thankful to the Trump administration is that they usually call a spade a spade. I mean, to call something a Department of Defense is really sort of obfuscating the fact that it's really a Department of War. Anyway, so Amodei sort of says, we have said to the Department of War that we are okay with using Anthropic for 98 or 99% of the use cases, except two particular things that they want. And of course, the moment they had the spat, OpenAI jumped in and said, we will take this contract. We don't work with Anthropic. All right. So there's a huge amount of stuff. And this is something which is growing quite a lot. There's money going into all kinds of autonomous things. And the Pentagon has now asked for $54 billion in the latest budget to put into all kinds of AI technologies for war. And this is something which also is the industry, in particularly some smaller companies like Palantir, like Anduril, have been pushing. So they have basically been arguing that, look, the Pentagon is really behind the times. You need to invest in these kinds of, in our kind of Silicon Valley, frontier technologies. And so that is what is basically coming in. Now, there is one final frontier which I'm really concerned about, and I want to sort of mention this because we are talking about we talked about nuclear weapons, which is the possible use of AI in what is called command and control for nuclear weapons. So in the United States, in Russia, there are a number of, I mean, they have large thousands of nuclear weapons, but they also have lived for decades with the fear that at any moment the other side, so it would have been the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and now it's Russia or maybe even China, is going to suddenly launch a nuclear attack against the United States, and vice versa in the case of the Soviet Union/Russia. And so what they have done is to invest a huge amount of money in a whole range of systems to try and detect when there are missiles and planes that are coming which might be carrying nuclear weapons. And so the two main technologies that they use are satellites that are looking for missile launches and radars that are looking at missiles coming in. And all of this information is fed into a central system, and that central system is supposed to decide whether there is an incoming attack or not. And then at that point, presumably the president will be notified, and the president will have to decide whether the United States will launch its own nuclear weapons in response, and when and how many, and so on and so forth, right? So this is the kind of situation. And the concern is, if you integrate AI into this, then what kinds of challenges, what kinds of errors might be possible? And even without integrating AI, there has always been the concern that there may be errors from the radars, from the satellites, where they see something else and interpret that as incoming missiles. So there have been cases where radars have picked up maybe a flock of birds or the moon rising and the radar waves sort of bouncing off that as the sign of an incoming attack. So this is well back in the 1960s and 70s, well before AI became a thing. Now what is happening is that it seems very likely that at some level, some forms of AI are being integrated already. So the idea that many of the people who are at the head of the nuclear weapons planning are basically saying, we want to do this faster. Just the way the military was saying that we need to do this faster, killing of people and identifying targets. These people are saying, we want to know very quickly what the information from the radars and the satellites and so on is saying, and also try and generate different options for the president. And so that is, I think, the direction that is going on. Earlier this year, there was information about some new AI contract for some kind of a nuclear command and control system. We don't know much details about it. This was just a kind of announcement on X. But these are all sort of concerning signs. And in a way, this is actually shifting back from even a couple of years ago when the Biden administration and Xi Jinping from China had sort of pledged to avoid the use of artificial intelligence in the control and deployment of nuclear weapons and so on and so forth, right? And there is widespread movement in the General Assembly to try and stop this integration of artificial intelligence to command and control of nuclear weapons. We don't, I mean, where this is going to go in today's sort of really dysfunctional UN environment, in a way where some of these big powers are able to block any kind of effort, is a question for a different time. But those are the directions in which I think we should be moving, trying to stop this dangerous development from happening in the meanwhile. And then in part that is true with this whole question of AI, because when you look at mainstream discussions about AI in nuclear command and control, one of the ideas you see from people who want to be seen as meaningful or respectable or serious is to say, oh yes, AI can be used in some ways, we can see some benefits from using this, but let's just keep a human in the loop, etc., right? I personally think that any idea of bringing in AI is a bad one. As the old sort of 1983 movie War Games said, things to do with nuclear war, it's a strange game. The only winning moves to not play. And I think trying to introduce anything about AI into the nuclear command and control, which is already such a risky thing, we are always been living at this very dangerous situation of nuclear weapons that can be launched at very short notice, hair trigger alert, and adding this unstable, unknown, unknowable element into that is, I think, extremely dangerous. And I will stop there and open up for discussions and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ramana. Thank you, Bene. That was just brilliant synthesis and analysis. Bene, thank you so much for helping us understand that, there are carbon consequences to the Google search. That those statistics are really, really alarming. And Ramana, also for your analysis on the emergency, like we're creating all of these new nuclear power plants when in actual fact we aren't, because they're too expensive. And the idea of the corporations wanting to control the public discourse, and to see this also because what the Bitcoin and the Palantir, the killer robots, these are not only creating a more dangerous environment for our globe writ large, but it's essentially lining the pockets of billionaires. And I think that like the billionaire class, the critique of that is definitely front and center for both AI and nuclear. So I would love to invite people to raise their hand if they have a question or a comment. And I just want to start off by asking the two of you to reflect yourselves on how do you think we disrupt the discourse? How do you think that we, like Bene seeing those devastating photographs of the miners in DRC, and Ramana still thinking about the effects of Chernobyl 40 years since that initial accident, and also Chernobyl becoming part of a theater of war, becoming part of a threat in this current war with Russia and Ukraine. So while people are queuing up to ask further questions, could you both address how do you think it's best for us to disrupt the public discourse going forward?
Should I go or Ramana? I mean, Kathleen, I'm a Gramscian scholar. So I really believe in the core function of discourse as an incredible, powerful weapon to really change the world. But of course, as Gramsci taught us, this needs time, this needs organizing, and the enemies are the common sense that we cannot disrupt, because what this common sense in Gramscian terms has always been doing to us was to say, well, AI is helping us, AI is liberating us, AI is able to help us outsourcing the tasks that are boring, the tasks we don't want to do. And so these mythologies that become common sense are very difficult to disrupt. And so my answer to this is really, we have to keep doing what exactly we're doing at this moment. We have to actually keep calling these mythologies for what they are. We have to actually explain that AI is actually a category that in reality doesn't exist, because a lot of the functions and the capability of AI, take general AI, have never been developed. And the forms of Gen AI models that we have are able to help us changing my resume into a beautiful Shakespearean sonnet. But is this what we need at the moment in times of climate emergency? So to go back to your question, I think actually what we're doing today to change this course is crucial, but we need to make sure that this is actually generating a movement that brings together indigenous groups, environmental groups, tech, anti-big tech groups, the no kings groups, because this is the type of capitalism that is, damaging humanity at the multiple level, so not just for the climate, but is, we're making this planet impossible to live also because of the war. And we see the connection with this capitalist development and war. So obviously, for me, another crucial point would be to start disrupting the structures, because the thing is, why the US is at this point of monopoly capitalism is because antitrust laws that always, were present in the country have not been implemented at all. So we just decided that antitrust was not something that we would need to restructure. And when you have the presence of these oligopolies, that's where you don't have a functional market anymore. So even if we want to approach a very plain neoliberal or liberal perspective, we need to completely start fragmenting. We need to start diversifying. We need to stop in this way. And I think this type of discourse should be really at the core, because this is a political economic issue. It's not an issue that can only be solved by tech design, which is something that academia was always trying to tell us. No, this is a political issue. And so we need the weapons of discourse to defeat it.
Yeah. Excellent points. I completely agree with Bene. It's sort of, just to sort of push the point further about Gramsci and common sense, Gramsci also argued that we need to replace common sense with good sense by trying to understand how the system works, and sort of talking about how the system is working by sort of moving away from the symptoms of the failure, the water demands, the sound, all of those problems, to trying to explain that the causes have to do with capital's requirement to continually grow and try to find new ways of exploiting and accumulating surplus, and trying to sort of explain how this is working is one thing. And the other thing I would say is that I also sort of increasingly say very explicitly that I'm a Luddite. People used, it's used as a disparaging term, as a term as oh, you don't know how to use technology. I actually wear it as a matter of pride. I've never used generative AI. I've never played with ChatGPT, and that of course means that certain kinds of conversations I cannot be part of. But then it also allows me to disrupt the conversation by saying I don't use it, and then people say, why are you not using it? And then I can explain why I'm not using it. And the last thing I'll say is that I think the people who really, I think, are going to resonate with a lot of these critiques and a lot of the structural challenges because of AI are actually the young people, right? They are the ones who are going to be most affected by all of these things, not just from the long-term ecological damage, but from the fact that many of them who are in college right now, you are in a university, Kathleen. So, the students who are there, the students who are in University of British Columbia in Sydney, all of them, they are going to go out into a job market where increasingly they are not getting jobs, for the simple reason that every company is trying to say we should not be hiring any more people, we should be investing more in AI. And many companies have put out sort of rules for, or not rules, but stipulations of how much AI you have to use. It used to be a few years ago, oh no, if you use AI, be very careful. We don't want any kind of intellectual contamination, blah, blah, blah. Now it is switched completely. They say you have to use a certain amount of AI. Show us how you're using AI in your thing, right? What then does that mean is that all of these companies are saying we are going to spend the money on AI and getting the capacity to buy AI, and we are not going to spend it on people, right? So they're not hiring anybody. So all of my students here, 90% of them are not getting jobs, right? And so there is a way in which for them, this is the real reality. And I'll just finish with one anecdote, which is to say that every year when I teach, in the beginning, the first class, I say, let's have a discussion about the use of AI. Okay. I'm not going to prescribe for you whether to use AI or not. I want us to decide this democratically. Okay. And I tell them, look, you guys are paying a lot of money to come here. You will get more out of me if you don't use AI, if you give me your drafts and I will give you comments, as opposed to you polishing it using ChatGPT or whatever. And in the last 1.5 years ago, when I did this first, the students basically said, no, 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 we want to use it. In the real world, will be using it, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, whatever, it's less work for me, right? I'm not going to try to force you. I want you to learn why you should not do this. This year, the same conversation, the students basically agreed. Okay, because I think some of the shine is going off this stuff. There's only so many times that you will kind of make some, strange, come up with some text or some poem or whatever it is. That fad is going to go away, and the reality is going to strike in. So, anyway, those are some of the ways that I talk about.
And actually, Ramana, I just had a conversation with one of the brightest student I had in the class. And she came to me and said, I gave up every Gen AI app on my mobile. I decided not to use it anymore. And I said, so I was curious because this is a greatest interest of mine. And she said, because I realized I can't even write a text anymore without using Gen AI. I cannot formulate, an abstract text without using AI. And this is worrying me and is bringing me so much anxiety because I see I'm not able to communicate in a way that I used to just by having relied on Gen AI in the last 2 years. And actually, this is corroborated by the latest studies I've seen that are actually quite worrisome because they are showing that if you use them, there is an MIT study that has been published around 12 months ago. If you use a Gen AI, for example, for 2 years in a row, you are becoming more reliant, but also lazy in a way. And so you're constantly outsourcing your cognitive abilities, and the engagement of your brain is very different. And what is really worrying about this is that another study is now showing that even for us, and we, claim to be able to write and think, right? Because we've been doing this for a while. Even for us, if we start being dependent on them, we're progressively not engaging these areas of the brain and progressively giving up these cognitive abilities. So this is actually one of the biggest problem that we should be discussing, and one that should be in every kind of discourse against big tech, like losing out our abilities that are cognitive abilities, but also the ability to think originally. I'm not even thinking about critical thinking. I'm considering thinking as a crucial ability that I see a lot of students losing. And I'm also just back from a research trip to China. And what has shocked me the most was to see the level of dependency on AI agents that a lot of Chinese people do at the moment. So you walk in the street and you really see them connecting to their iPhone in a way that is different from in the West. So they talk to their AI agent constantly. And between TikTok and the exposure to constant streaming of videos and this conversation with AI agent, they are constantly fatigued. And so the cognitive engagement is obviously much less visible, precisely because you're constantly outsourcing. So is this the kind of society that we are building? And what to do about this? Because we are already seeing the effects. And obviously this adds to the crucial social and environmental issues that we discussed. But I think that actually this should be out in the discourse in a way that it's often not in the discourse. So and the students are actually already seeing this on themselves. And the ones that want to learn are the ones that we really need to engage on these issues because they are our, biggest hope.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bene, and thank you, Ramana, for that. We have a question here in the room.
Just talk? Okay. Thank you so much. This conversation, part of it also reminds me of the librarians back in the early aughts when Google was first introduced. And one of it was just like, our students are going to lose critical thinking skills. And whether or not that has happened remains to be seen. What I am interested is your critique on the concept of digital divide as we continue to move forward and what are the ways in which that we've been sold that technology does bridge within particular communities and create a level playing field. Something that comes to mind is Tahrir Square and the use of social media and how that has managed to move us towards an understanding of the political crises and the political economic crises that we're in this moment. So yeah, I'm interested in hearing your critique on the digital divide. Thank you so much.
And that was Myrna Morales, who is one of our librarians here at Naropa. Thank you, Myrna.
You want me to go first?
Yeah, I might just start.
That was a very important question. Like we know that actually in terms of the connection of being connected, right? Some progress has been made with, for example, 4G or 5G technology, reaching out also, for example, and giving access. But the question that is really crucial here is giving access to what? Because what we are witnessing is the emergency, for example, especially I'm using the US cases, but I can use also the case of Europe. If you don't have publicly funded content, you're actually witnessing the an emergency of local news deserts, for example, an emergency of lack of proper investigative journalism that will give, people access to informed information, then to forge their public opinion and to be able to join in a conversation and participation. So there are like two major issues here. Like the first is that we see that the business model of most Western social media, and I love to refer to them as digital lords, because we're not talking about platforms. Platforms are neutral spaces for conversation. Digital lords are actually major corporations that are imposing a business model and therefore also imposing some kind of content on us, right? So, and we saw it with the Gaza genocide, the impossibility, to have access to information that was not completely, often flattened down to a very major dominant discourse that everything that we say about the genocide is necessarily anti-Semitic, okay? So the question is access to what in terms of the digital divide? And unfortunately, all the premises that I've seen when I discussed the information superhighways, the liberation that was coming with the internet have actually proven to, also carry major problems. And why they've carried all major problems? Because we used a web that was absolutely public and absolutely free in terms of having public money invested on it. So let's remember that digital lords have been built not because they had an intuition, but on public investments that came from university and the defense in the US. And this is where the major wealth has started actually to bloom. So let's remember that if we want to maintain, some kind of diversity also in the media that are offered online on the social media, and therefore reducing the gap and inform citizens, we need to produce them. And investigative journalists have to be paid. Labor is expensive for this. Experts need to be paid to be present in these platforms. Now, we have created a situation also because antitrust law and regulation have stopped being implemented, where social media will become extremely toxic, as we know, with the major inquiries that we see in the US, in the UK, in all of Europe. And so now we're worried for our kids being exposed to this type of content, being, prompted into mental illness crisis, which is something now so huge in China that it is in the public discussion because we know the level of addiction and the level of problems that have been generated. So again, it is crucial to raise and consider this issue, and also to consider some different form of funding for the content that gets shared. So some public intervention through also regulation, but some public intervention to, make sure that the right investigative unbiased type of reporting that we need to inform the public is there. Because otherwise we reach a situation with AI where content that is biased, the so-called fake news that your president loves to mention, are actually replicated to a level that it is impossible to actually be rightly informed, because the level of disinformation is only growing, and this is accelerated by Gen AI, for example.
I think we have time for one more question. Ramana, you wanted to
Can I
weigh in on
just
that?
jump in very
Yes, yes,
quickly?
yes,
Just to say two
please.
things. I think two things can be true at the same time. So on the one hand, we definitely need changes to the digital infrastructure, what some people call a public stack and stuff like that. We can't at this point really realistically move out of the digital world in a way. But it's also useful to remember Audre Lorde's famous statement, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, right? So there's a limit to how much you can do with all of these kinds of reforms and sort of suggestions. And we have to keep that reality in mind, because unless you confront the ultimate sort of the more underlying, capitalist impetus, monopoly capitalist impetus to grow these kinds of things in certain ways, we will not be able to actually solve the problem. We can say these are band-aids we can do, and we should be doing those things because you don't want blood to be going out. But there's only, unless you address the more underlying problem, we can't really do much.
Ace, would you like to go ahead with your question?
Yes, if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful talks. I've got for 40 years in the computer business, and the last few years things have changed. Behind me is a logarithmic scale that I did with a Manhattan Project scientist, actually. And the reason I'm mentioning it is to ask my question, which is, you mentioned LLM training, and the way I see it is there's so much more information constantly being added to the world. How can these systems possibly keep up and be claiming to know everything that they claim to know without growing themselves exponentially? And where in the world could this possibly end? I guess I don't see a future for AI that is other than destroying the whole world and eating the whole world. And thanks for the wonderful presentation.
Yeah. I saw another hand. I think Kentaro Shintako, you want to ask your question?
Yes, just briefly, thank you very much for the presentation. I work at Columbia Climate School, and we study the megatons to megawatts project between the US and Russia that converted 20,000 nuclear weapons worth of Russian uranium to US civilian electricity, which sustained about 10% of electricity in the US for 20 years. My question is, how can we analyze economic and environmental benefits of nuclear disarmament while avoiding the justification of legacies and harms of AI and nuclear energy? Thank you.
So could you state your question again? Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Yes. My question is, how can we analyze economic and environmental benefits of nuclear disarmament while avoiding the justification of harmful legacies and impacts of AI and nuclear energy?
Yeah. I'll take a very quick crack at that. And also, I mean, to Ace, I agree totally. I think, the future is bleak, to put it simply. And as if these LLMs really were to grow, I think what gives me some hope is what I mentioned earlier, that this is probably a bubble. There's no real good business case for these things. They use so much resources to generate things which you can just, get for much, much smaller amounts of money. And so I don't see, for example, college students actually paying what it takes to generate the college essay that they use these things for, right, in a realistic sense. So the business case is weak, but unfortunately, there is so much capital sitting in Silicon Valley that they can fund a lot of unsustainable, uneconomic activities for a long time. On your question, I think you're absolutely right. Disarmament disarmament is something which is very, very important. And there are ways of, I think, doing that without sustaining nuclear energy. I think the megatons to megawatts project, I mean, it may have had some nice rhyming to it, but I don't think that that's the only way in which the uranium could have been used, right? You could have just said, we're going to take this, downblend it, and then dispose it, period, not put it inside a nuclear reactor, right? And so that's something which is a choice. The problem is that the nuclear industry is so powerful that they would try to say we are the way in which you have to build more nuclear reactors in order to use the plutonium, in order to use the uranium. I think we should not fall for that argument. Last words to you, Benny.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I really think what is important here is to really build the kind of discourse that really connects the positive effect of disarmament with the lack of positivity of investment in nuclear energy in times of climate emergency. And I'm repeating this because I am shocked by the lack of a debate on the climate crisis that I've seen in the West at the moment. And, we talk often about a Brussels effect whenever, Brussels intervenes, for example, in terms of regulation or antitrust, we have a conversation. But now we see a Washington effect that has deprived the Western world of a conversation on sustainability. As this research to China, I just did this trip in China, the conversation on sustainability was still alive because the climate emergency is something very visible everywhere around the world. We're constantly dealing with weather patterns changes, constantly dealing with cyclones. Sicily had the first cyclone in the history of Italy. And yet, we are forgetting this, and how sustainable is to build new nuclear reactors in condition of climate change. Many of them have to be built by the coast. How do we do this in times, where the coasts are being completely reduced and we have, the sea level rising? I mean, it's something that needs to be connected and, by us, because without us, this is not going to happen. Without us, we will still have the UN report that is saying, we see a nuclear drive generated by big tech. And so we need to resist this, and we need to do it precisely in universities that have to also embrace a different rhetoric about AI, because universities should be a place for universal learning, dialogue, and a community that shares. But most importantly, we are here to educate. And the job of educating is something that is challenging, but it's still a human job with humans. And we want to foster creativity and originality in this type of thinking. And this is why we're here. And I think actually this is a way to make a difference. So thank you, Kathleen, really for inviting us and for having these brilliant people asking very important questions.
Well, thank you both for joining. And, just to say, no war. War is accelerating the climate emergency. That's another thing that we're not talking about. This crazy illegal invasion in Iran proffered by the US government is just, it's beyond. So there's plenty for us to do. Zoe in the chat says one thing to disrupt the discourse is engage in the general strike here in the US from the No Kings movement on May Day. I'm sure there'll be other actions on May Day across the world. But just to take a moment to really thank you, Bene and Ramana, for enlightening us today, for deepening our thinking and our commitment. And, what I always like to share is that when we engage in these existential threats, we actually find the most beautiful humans to, be in community with and to be in action with. So with that, we wish everybody a great motivation to your addition to the resistance and the movement towards a life-sustaining society, which does involve the human heart and the human brain. So thank you both so very much. And thank you all for taking the time to join us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Kathleen. This is wonderful. As you rightly mentioned, during these times of these really difficult times, one of the things that we all have to hold on is to some sense of community, whether it's, whether it is virtual or real, knowing that there are other people out there who are thinking about these things and working on these is what keeps us going. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Okay.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.